Okay, so moving outside of the lens, we could have some other aberrations as well. And most of you will probably recognize this one. It's probably the most famous of the aberrations, called a vignette. So in a vignette, we have basically a darkening of the corners. But one of the things that you may not know is that this can happen for a lot of reasons, more than just the obvious ones. So in this case, we could have a problem of, well, I mean, explain to me what might be the problem in this particular image. Why did we have such a bad vignette like this? Yes?
Was it a really tall building?
No, it doesn't have to do anything with the building. It has to do probably on something that we put on the lens itself. Right, so the lens shade itself, the lens hood, might be too small for this lens, and it might be causing the corners of this particular image to be too dark. And so this is an example of a mechanical vignette, something that happens as a result of a mechanical blockage of light coming into the lens. But there are other examples as well. So for example, an optical vignette can happen within the lens itself. So let's say that you have a lens that looks like this, and it's a very, very wide aperture lens. But if you look through the lens, not straight on, through the side, for example, you'll see that you don't actually see a perfect circle through the end of that lens. And this is a perfect example of an optical vignette. You are actually being blocked because of the design of the lens. This portion of the image circle, this entire portion right here, is being blocked by the barrel of the lens. And this may not seem like that big of a deal, but if you take a photo with a lens that looks like this, you will actually see the result is quite a big deal. So if you take a photo that has with this lens and use a very low f number, very wide aperture, you would get in the center exactly what you expect. This very nice bokeh that has very circular, out of focus areas. But then as you move towards the outside of the frame, keep in mind that the outside of the frame are objects that are going to be off to the side and shining their light through the lens like this, then you might get these sort of cat's eyes view of the bokeh. So you can see here that rather than being perfectly circular, it's almost elliptical. It's this cat's eye shaped instead. So there is even one more way that we can have a vignette as well. And unfortunately, this one is a little bit more complicated, but this deals with the way that the light flows, or the way that the light is focused onto the sensor itself. So if you remember oh man, I'm blanking now. This is happening with surprising frequency, isn't it? So the inverse square law, that's what I was talking. So when we were talking about flashes, we also were talking about the inverse square law, where we have light fall off due to the distance of that light. So that's not exactly what's going on here, but you can use it as sort of an analog. If we have a lens, for example, a very wide angle lens that has to get somewhat close to the sensor in order to focus its light. Now it's the light that it sends onto the sensor is going to be very sharp. It's going to be very oblique angle. So this light here has farther to travel than the light that goes right to the center of the image. So we might have an optical vignette because this light, because it has farther to go, might fall off. We might have this light fall off problem. Now it's more complicated than that. It's not actually this reason. What may be more accurate would be that the micro lenses on this sensor here are just not designed to capture light coming in at an oblique angle very well. Another reason might be just similar to the way that when the sun goes down at the end of the day, because it's at a harsher angle, it's not bearing straight down, there's not as much heat being passed through to the surface of the Earth. That's another thing here. So all of this light that's being sent here is just not as concentrated, so to speak, as the light that is being sent right to the middle of the image. So we could have this, what's called natural vignette, that can occur, especially in wide angle lenses, as a result of just these optical properties that can occur. Now, there are ways that optical engineers can correct for this. Obviously, the longer or the more parallel that the light comes into the center, or to the sensor rather, the better this problem will be. So we can eliminate this natural vignette by making this light fall very, very perpendicular onto the sensor itself. And that's indeed what happens in a lot of the modern lenses. So luckily now, natural vignette, I would argue, doesn't happen a lot in the higher end wide angle lenses as much as it may have in the past, just because these engineers have figured out a way to get around this particular problem, and this could be correctable nowadays. Okay, any questions so far? Lots of good stuff so far. Yeah.
So it seems like in order to help correct vignetting and a lot of the other aberrations,
Mm-hmm.
it seems like more lenses are put in there to accommodate that, but doesn't that reduce the power of light that's entering the lens in the first place? Because you're putting more and more.
So by putting more and more elements of the light, we would be decreasing the amount of light that's actually entering into the end. So, so I would say that with, I mean, it depends on how the lens is designed. I think with properly designed lenses, I don't think adding more elements will necessarily make it much darker, especially since a lot of the loss of light occurs from reflections of the light. So if these lenses or these glass elements are not properly coated and the light is reflected off of it, then that's where we lose a lot of the light from them. But if they are properly coated, as we see in optical glass and especially very high-end filters, then more of the light is passed through, and only the frequencies that we don't care about, like the infrared or the ultraviolet frequencies, are then blocked out and reflected off. And that will allow more of the visible light to pass through with less reduction in contrast due to flare or ghosting. So as light bounces around between the elements inside, that's where we see a lot of the lens flares and ghostings that can occur, especially when we're pointed at a very strong light source, like the sun, for example. Lens flares are very common in that case. But as our coatings get better, then I think that problem starts to disappear. So we're battling that problem, what could be a problem in that case, with newer technology, with other advances in that particular arena, if that makes sense. So, but yes, I mean, it is possible with I think with every glass element you add, there is an additional risk of it, but there's ways to mitigate it as well, especially when these optical engineers are actually dealing with the design of the lens in its entirety. They can probably be able to do it. Okay, now one of the things you'll notice about these vignettes is that some of them are actually possible to correct by stopping down, while others are not. So for example, a mechanical vignette, this one, I mean, if you have a hood that's too small, or if your hand is blocking it, or if you have a filter in front that's too small for the image circle and you're actually blocking some light in, then you may not actually do any better by stopping down this particular, by stopping down the lens. However, if you do have an optical vignette, as is the case in this one where we have the cat's eyes, then obviously stopping down is going to help a lot, because this smaller aperture will actually allow the light that's being passed through to come in even at these strange angles, these off-center angles, and be able to go in all the way without bother to the sensor itself. Natural vignette, this is a physical property of light. So if your lens naturally vignettes, then there's nothing you can do. No amount of stopping down is going to be able to help you. So one of the things, if you remember, that digital camera manufacturers are saying that they are really improving the way that their light gathering capabilities is improving the micro lenses on their sensors. And this, I think, does a good job of showing us how improving the micro lenses might be able to give us better light gathering performance, especially at the outer edges and the corners of a frame when we're dealing with very wide angle lenses. So the better that we can deal with these oblique light patterns, then the better that we will be able to get our photo to be. Okay, now there's other optical aberrations as well that can happen because of your lens. So distortions. Now these are particularly bad in consumer cameras, but as you start spending more and more dollar signs on lenses, then you generally see these particular types of distortions go away. Now, if you look at a lot of digital camera reviews, you'll actually hear some mention usually of barrel distortion or pincushion distortion. That is what this is referring to. So if we have some object that should be rendered as a perfect square on the image, we take a photo of this square with the lens that either has a barrel distortion or a pincushion distortion, then we will see this object rendered like this or like this, respectively. So a barrel, imagine that you have a big barrel and you basically have printed out your image and you wrap it around this barrel and you look at it straight on. That's what this looks like. It's sort of bulging out like a barrel would bulge out. And a cushion, the pin cushion, well, this is perhaps a little bit weaker, but imagine that you have a pin cushion and you have an image on it and you're pushing on that pin cushion, and then that is the result that you would see from this. And so it's important to realize that these are separate distortions than the sort of distortion you would get from a wide angle perspective. So if you are using a very wide angle and you get close to your object, you don't necessarily have to get either barrel or pincushion distortion. It's important to note that these are distinct things. So frequently, classes of lenses like wide-angle lenses and telephoto lenses are susceptible and are prone to specific types of aberrations. I think specifically wide angles are prone to pincushion distortion, and telephoto are prone to barrel distortions. But you should be able to, in an ideal world, there are ways that we would be able to remove these distortions from our images. And just to show you a couple of examples, I have here two images that should be perfectly straight or perfectly square. And I would use this stick as a way of showing you how straight it is, but obviously this is not going to help very much because it's not straight itself. But here on the left, this is an example of which distortion? Yep, barrel. So it bulges on the side, as you can see a little bit. And this one on the right, this building, pincushion. Yep, because it's a bit thinning. So it looks a bit thinner than it should normally. It's not actually perfectly straight up and down. And it's most noticeable, I think, on the edge of this particular building. And usually when you see a review for a digital, especially a consumer camera which has a fixed lens, or if you see a review for an SLR lens by itself, you will generally hear some mention of either barrel or pincushion distortion. And unless you're dealing with, I don't think it's really that big of a concern unless you're dealing with some consumer camera or some consumer lens. Then that is when you should probably pay attention to what they're talking about, because I think nowadays, as especially the higher quality lenses have gotten rid of a lot of the distortions that are found there. But it's not to say that this problem is eliminated altogether, because you can definitely purchase cameras that have these particular distortions. So it's important to pay attention to, but I think really only if you're dealing with some of the lower end of some of these things. Okay, hope I haven't lost any of you yet, because we have some more good stuff coming up. One of them is this topic that I've been talking about and referring to for a long time, but never actually got around to explaining it to you. That is this concept of refraction. So now we were talking about some of the things that can happen as a result of the way that the lens is engineered. So some of the problems that can happen because we have misshaped glass elements, or we're a bit lazy, or we want to produce a lens that's a little bit inexpensive, so we wanted to cut some corners somewhere. Now we are going to deal with some aberrations that can occur because of the actual physical properties of light. And one of them is this concept of refraction. So many of you might know this through things such as a prism or through water, for example. When you're looking at an object that's under a pool, it's not exactly where you think it is. And this, as you know, comes another way we can say this is if you have a pencil and a big glass of water and it looks broken, that's because of refraction. And what happens is that as light enters this interface from one medium to another, so for example from air to glass, so in this case this is a glass prism, then it changes speed. And as it changes speed, its direction also bends slightly. But even more importantly is that each wavelength of light bends a different amount depending on its frequency, because these wavelengths of light have different energies, and so they bend at different quantities. So as you can see, as we refract this light through a prism. And this is why when you put sunlight through a prism, you see this rainbow of colors, is that the light is bent and each of the frequencies is separated, and you see a rainbow of colors on the table or on the sheet of paper next to the prism. And unfortunately, this is something that we have to battle with constantly. Well, we being optical engineers, so really they have to battle with constantly when they're designing lenses, is being able to figure out how they can bend or alter the path of light without getting each of these colors to split. And what can happen if that happens is we get something that looks like this. So let's say we have a lens. So this is in the more traditional lens shape. Remember that this is the same sort of thing. We have a point source of light that's nearly infinity distance away, and we're trying to take a picture of it. And it should render as a perfect circle or a perfect dot on our sensor. But as the light enters the lens and as it refracts through the lens, then the colors split. And so we can see if this is our film plane right here, we might have optimized this lens for, say, the green wavelength, which is a pretty good way of doing things, especially in older lenses. Then we can get the green wavelength perfectly in focus, but the blue and the red wavelengths are slightly out of focus. So even though the green might be, perfect dot, we would get this sort of weird color halo around each of these dots. And the same thing would happen if the light was slightly off-center. We would get this weird sort of aberration that, almost a rainbow just off-center if we were looking at an object that is not directly in the middle of this image. And just to give you an example of what this might look like, there's two images here. The top one is optically decent. The bottom one has this chromatic, what's called a chromatic aberration, that results because of this refraction that can occur in the lens. So pay particularly close attention to the sides, where you see here there's this sort of hue of blue off to the side, and on the other side there's this hue of red that exists on each particular edge of this building. And that's because the red and the blue wavelengths are out of focus in different areas, and the green is focused just fine. So we get not only this sort of blur, but also we get these weird color fringes that can exist on each particular size. Now, or on each particular side rather. Now imagine what would happen if we took this photo in black and white. How would this look? Yeah, just fuzzy, just really blurry, really fuzzy. And it would be difficult if we had just black and white to differentiate this from this being out of focus. It would just be difficult to be able to tell. And so really, this has been more of a problem lately, especially as well, not particularly lately. I mean, I know color film's been around for a long time, but I'm just saying that it's now especially a problem, especially now that we are doing what's called pixel peeping. So those of us with digital cameras, I know you love to take photos, bring it home and show it on your screen at 100% and look at each individual pixel and say, nope, not sharp enough. Well, this is not something that was really done back in the film days. I mean, you would have magnified it and viewed it in a larger size, but there's no concept of pixels really in film. And so we didn't have the same sort of problem. So arguably now, I think manufacturers being pushed harder than ever to design glass elements and lenses as a whole that are more optically perfect because of these very fine levels of pixels that we have in each of these images. Now, a related chromatic aberration that can occur is something that's very, very familiar to those of us with consumer cameras, or rather just compact digital cameras. That is this purple fringing. So if you notice around the horse's mane, the horse's ear, and up, all the way up there, there's this sort of purple tinge to the light. And this happens especially with backlit objects or very high contrast areas, such as this case where the hair is somewhat dark, the background is somewhat light, and you're getting this high contrast change. And you see this noticeable amount of purple fringing. Now, this is distinct from the chromatic aberration due to refraction that we saw before. Usually, purple fringing deals with, frankly, the micro lenses that exist in front of a camera's sensor. So if you have a relatively inexpensive consumer digital camera, its micro lenses may not be made to the same specifications as that of a much more expensive digital SLR. And so those micro lenses usually just like we have in this particular example, where we have a lens and we can optimize its use for perhaps one wavelength. Usually those micro lenses will be designed to focus the green wavelengths very well, not these other colors. And so sometimes this is the result, is that because this blue and this red are slightly out of focus, we get this very strange chromatic aberration. So this is a problem, and this can even happen even if you don't have an inexpensive camera, even if you have, you know, the price of a small car, digital camera, flagship from Canon or Nikon, you could still get purple fringing from lenses. So I'm not saying that lenses are not at fault for this. It's just that usually, typically, it deals with the sensor itself. Sometimes these inexpensive lenses will also, well, I mean, not even inexpensive, but just any lens can be prone to purple fringing or fringing in general in very high contrast regions of a scene, particularly at the outside ranges of that particular lens. Now, there are some fixes for this. Usually, camera manufacturers and lens manufacturers will use a glass element called fluorite, which has a very low level of optical dispersion. And the whole point of this fluorite is that it does not change the speed of the wavelengths as much as just a regular glass element would. And so all of these wavelengths of light get focused into the same point. Now, the downside is that fluorite is extremely expensive, and typically even the most expensive lenses will only have one, maybe two fluorite elements within them, but they will be very, very optically, they'll be very well corrected for these optical aberrations as a result.